Going to record here. Hi to everyone who's joining us. This is the very first of our DLH writers panel for 2021. We had just a little technical difficulty, but we've got all of our panelists here today. We are going to focus on living donation today. And the reason is not just because the whole world is focusing on living donation, it seems, in the donation community and things, but Hollywood is really loving the living kidney donation storyline. They're telling a lot of these stories. So what I've done is gotten together some of our DLH experts. We have Judge Derek Mosley, who is a kidney recipient himself. We have Judge Joanne Eyring, who is a living kidney donor. And we have Dr. McDonald, who is a kidney transplant surgeon. So we are going to dig into, what I wanted to do was actually tackle this through Hollywood, through the lens of the entertainment industry, and look at three of the most recent living kidney donation storylines that have been on television, and look at the conflicts that they decided to pursue, because great storytelling really revolves around a conflict. And so what we tend to see is Hollywood kind of grasping at these conflicts, which perpetuate fears and myths. We're calling them Hollywood myths. And those, according to research, stop people from registering as donors. So what we want to do is sort of replace. We want to give Hollywood and entertainment writers some new access to real life conflicts that can help them create even better storylines, because really they're using kind of the same conflicts, which are old and tired. So let's give them some new conflicts, something that is based in reality and real life stories. So at the very end too, I want to show you all the Be Like Gina PSA, which it aired last week on CBS during Be Positive and has had a lot of results. So we're very excited about that. And what we did with that PSA was we tied living donation to a sense of purpose. So I want to show you guys that and talk about that in terms of a way of talking about organ donation, living kidney donation. So I want to jump in on the television show Billions, which is on Showtime, which is about rich people. And so rich people are doing shady things when a rich guy needs a kidney. And I think what's interesting is, it really hits the idea of desperation and what happens when your organs are failing and there is a shortage of organs. And I do think the one thing Hollywood has kind of gotten right is, and I don't know how much I love this, but they have made America aware that there's a shortage. And so almost every conflict comes up because there aren't enough. And so I think that is very interesting. But Judge Mosley, I want you to kind of launch in and tell us, because you were in a very similar situation to one of the Billions characters. I don't know if you have billions, so maybe it's a little different for you, but there's still that feeling of like, okay, my organ is failing. I'm going to need to go on dialysis and look for a transplant. So talk to us about your personal journey with that.
Sure. Thank you, Tanaya. So I was diagnosed with end-stage renal disease, and my option was a transplant or dialysis, I guess, for the rest of my life. So of course we opted for transplant. And then it came down to, I had to do dialysis until that transplant was going to be able to be performed. So I had two options. The first option was hemodialysis, which is probably the type of dialysis that most people are familiar with. And then the second option was peritoneal dialysis, which is the one I actually opted for. So when you talk about hemodialysis, it mostly involves maybe like 3 times a week for 2-3 hours a day doing that type of dialysis. And as a judge, I'm in court from 8:30 in the morning till about 4:30 in the evening. So it was very difficult for me to take a 2-3 hour chunk out of my day to do that dialysis. So we opted for peritoneal, which was a process of putting a fluid into your peritoneum and then it pulls it out. So during the course of your cycles, the machine puts in and pulls out fluid, taking out impurities out of the body. And so I did that for 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. So mostly I did it at night while I was sleeping. So it allowed me to go to work. But however, when you do that type of dialysis, you have to do it every single day. And then you have this machine with you at home. And if you travel, I have to go to a conference or do anything, I have to bring this machine with me. So it's very cumbersome of a process. And all during this time, I'm waiting to see whether or not my friend, Joanne, who's also on this and is also a judge, my colleague and best friend, whether or not she was going to be a match. She had agreed to be tested to see if she was a match. And so we went through that process. It was a series of tests to see, and we are different in size. So I had to make sure I had to get my BMI down in order to do the transplant. And so that whole process was about 2 years. From the moment I got on dialysis to the moment I did the transplant was 2 years. Wow. So that involved every single day doing dialysis, that whole process. And the best way to describe it is, I always say it's sort of like a roller coaster. You get a series of highs and lows. So Joanne passes one test and she's good to go. So you're like, yes, you got that one test done, we're good to go. And then they say, your BMI is too high. So then I have to go on, continue to work on my diet and try to lose weight to get my BMI down. And then Joanne passes another test and I'm still working on my BMI. And so it's just that the time is going by. And then we finally think we've got it all set. And then Joanne has one last test. And then they tell her that, well, based on this test, it doesn't seem like this is going to work. And then she's thrust with this, passing this information on to me. And in that process, we find out that the test is actually okay. We're actually all right. So we're back on again. So the best way to describe that process while you're waiting is a roller coaster. And it's important, not to let the highs get too high or the lows get too low, and just try to ride it out. And like I said, that process from beginning to end was about a 2-year process. So
in Hollywood terms, that's like 2 minutes, right? 2 years equals
right.
2 minutes.
Right,
that's one of the things in Hollywood, right? Where just truncated timelines where you're like, oh, that never could have happened. I didn't realize the 2 years. And I think what you're talking about too is in there, the highs and lows and those roller coaster, those are sort of these mini conflicts, right? Where, you're the conflict of sort of knowing that your kidneys are failing and then your treatment options and having to choose between your treatment options, then, then the idea of a living donor stepping up, as that, and then what I'll have to go through, what you have to do. That's really interesting about the BMI and you having to then work on that. And then that conflict.
And then, they don't tell you also, so I had to do the peritoneal dialysis at home. So that's a whole instruction period. So I had to go in and learn how to use that machine and make sure everything was sanitary. And so there's a process to get to the actual transplant that a lot of people don't tell that story. You're right. You get diagnosis to transplant and within a matter of minutes on TV, but there's a lot of things that happen in between.
Yeah. And, peritoneal isn't something that a lot of Hollywood storylines have picked up on, which could be a really interesting storyline for people, just to have a character who is on peritoneal dialysis. Like, this is just how they're living. And it's not even like this big conflict, but sort of this is how life is. Would actually be really interesting and I think open people's eyes to the option of peritoneal dialysis, because I think a lot of people with kidney disease don't even really know about or think about peritoneal dialysis. Dr. Eyring, Judge Eyring, I want to, everyone's got good, like solid, precursors to their names, doctors and judges here, that your parents are all very proud, I bet, because this is what everyone wanted for you. But I wanted you to pick up a little bit on that final test, because you told us this story. And I think this is a really interesting story that we'll dive a little bit back into your backstory, but as you were going through the process, there was sort of this final test that really created a lot of conflict for both you and for Judge Mosley. Could you talk about that final test and what it meant for you and then what it meant for him?
Sure. And it wasn't really the final test, but
Okay.
it seemed like the final test for him because it was a year and a half into this whole peritoneal life of his. But so it was the kidney function test, and I had done the tests the week before, and that I got the results, and I was in Colorado when my coordinator called and said that the results of the kidney function test didn't come back well enough, and they said I wasn't a viable candidate, that the numbers were lower than they should be, because once you give a kidney, you lose some function, overall function. And so I'm in Colorado and I need to tell Derek, but it's not something you tell over the phone, and he's already in a place that every day is one step forward, two steps back, and he's such an upbeat person, and so and a lot of people still don't know about this. It's just family and very close friends, and so his emotions are often taken out on myself, or I'm sure his wife, and because he's trying to keep normal with everyone else. So I'm trying to make it the best. And now at this point, we're thinking I'm the match, and I'm told I'm not a viable match. So I ended up deciding to write a text, this longest text in the history of text life, I think. And it was just outlining details so that he would hear everything. It wasn't just that I was backing out. So I sent this text, and he calls and says, well, thanks for trying. And he's trying to be upbeat. And now we're back to square one. And then an hour later, maybe it was the next day, the doctor calls and said, your numbers weren't that bad. Are you willing or interested in doing another test? There are other tests we can do. So that first test was a blood test. And then I said, of course, I will do whatever it takes. And I said, I'll be back in town, next week, blah, blah, blah. So came in and I did this 24-hour urine collection, and handed in that big jug, and they come back with, you're good, we're good to go. And I thought, whoa, you might be good to go. We got one bad test and one good test. I'm kind of thinking, to me right now, 2 out of 3 would be better than just one good and one bad. And so and everything goes through your coordinator. And at the time I had a different coordinator than my final one, which I guess it's not important, but anyway, so she was not very good. This first one was not very good at explaining or comment, just explaining things. And she just said, well, the doctor said, these are the numbers and blah, blah, blah. And then I said, well, I guess, normally people would think a blood test is more accurate than a urine test. And then she kind of got short with me, and I thought that was odd. And I thought, okay, what? And then my doctor called and said, I understand you have concerns. We can set up a meeting. And she did. And then I said, I'm not really concerned about myself in the big picture, but I don't want to have something happen to me because we're just want to give him a kidney. And I said, he is my best friend. I will do whatever it takes. But if this were your kidney, would you be doing this? And then, so she, looks up both of our medical records, and she said, well, you have a team and it has to be 100%. My team is separate from his team. They do not talk to each other until the very end. And, I could change my standards, as far as my cutoffs. I said, no, I don't want you to do anything different than you should do with anyone else, or what. I just want to know, is this safe? And then she said, would you feel better with another test? And I said, yes, I would. And so then I did do another type of a blood test, and it was drinking a lot of water and all these blood tests. It took a morning, and those came back with the same numbers as the urine test. So I was good to go.
Wow.
But what was interesting is that she really did make me feel like she is on my side. She would do whatever it takes. And just note that any donor is told at any point in this whole process, even at to the time that you're being rolled into the OR or into the operating room, that you can change your mind. And the recipient doesn't have to know that you changed your mind. They will just come up with a story and say, you know, she's not a viable candidate for whatever reason.
You know, I think that that's one of the very interesting things that Hollywood hasn't picked up on is the fact that really where some of this conflict can come from is an internal conflict of kind of going through this process and not knowing, you know, for a living donor, kind of getting to a point where you're like, oh, I don't really want to do this, but I don't want to let someone down. I don't want to let my mom or dad or uncle or, you know, best friend, I don't want to let them down, because I mean, what I'm hearing in your story as well, and with the long text and things like that is, you know, there's so much investment in the process. So mentally, you're both at this kind of roller coaster thing, and to be told then this isn't it. I think that too is a really interesting dynamic and conflict, and almost where you could jump into a story where, you know, where people think that everything is going fine, and then, you know, they're getting that test that sort of starts to unravel the process. But I think also, you know, that pushing that you did as a patient, right? So that next test and that next test to make yourself feel confident. And obviously your best friend doesn't want you to not feel confident in doing this donation. I want to jump into the Good Doctor, because a lot of what you're talking about kind of comes out in this Good Doctor episode, which was called Decrypt, which was aired on February 22nd, so kind of recently. And I yelled at the screen several times on this one. I don't know if you guys do that, yell at the screen when you watch these TV shows. But the first one I yelled at the screen about was that the young woman who needs a kidney, and the doctor says you're going to need a kidney transplant, we'll get you, you know, worked up for the list. And she says, doctor, that means that someone has to die for me. And I was like, no. You know, but I do hear that from transplant recipients. And I think it's really important. Like, I would have loved for that character of the doctor to turn to her and say, no, you know, someone passed away. It was very tragic and very sudden, which it always is with deceased donation. And the yes is what is going to give you life. So if you're going to pray for a family, you're not praying for death, you're praying for solace, for guidance, you're praying for a yes, you're not praying for a death. And I really would love to see that scene. To me, like, that would be the end all scene. But there is that element of kind of guilt and responsibility that is embedded in a character who is a transplant recipient. And Judge Mosley, I'm wondering, I know that's true with deceased donation, because I know a lot of transplant recipients who've received with a deceased donor. Do you feel like there's a truth to that, and being the recipient from a living donor, that you feel responsible to live a great life, kind of?
Oh, most definitely. Because, you know, your donor is present and you see them every day. In my case, I see Joanne every day. And so I want to make sure she knows that I'm taking this kidney seriously. I'm treating it the best I can. And fortunately, Joanne's good at keeping on me too about, should you really be eating that? I don't know if you should be eating that. And, you know, that might have too much salt. Just yesterday with corned beef, I don't know if you should be eating that corned beef. And so anyway, but yeah, you have that, because you feel like I know Joanne will never make me feel this way, but I feel like I owe it to her to show I'm going to live my best life with this organ.
I think that's really a very authentic take for a transplant recipient. You know, I do feel like with Billions and others, they get into this mentality of desperation, right? Like they're desperate to stay alive, versus this feeling of, real gratitude and responsibility. I don't know that there's been really a character developed where I really see the level of both gratitude and commitment to living well post-transplant that I see in personally with like every single transplant recipient I know. The second issue that I saw on the Good Doctor episode was one of coercion. And I think that is a very common conflict. It comes up in a lot of different ways, but this idea of coercing somebody into the donation. And in this particular case, convoluted story short, the medical team themselves lied to the altruistic donor about the kind of person that she was going to be donating to. Was a recently released felon, and they made up kind of this very, this compelling story of why the person was in jail. And then when the medical team left the room, they're like, you don't know that, or that wasn't true. And she's like, well, we've got to get these people transplanted. So it's almost like, well, you got to do what you got to do in order to get people transplanted. And I was so appalled by that, because there is such a lack of trust in the medical community, just in general. And there's such a lack of trust when it comes to deceased donation. And now there's sort of this lack of trust around, kind of potentially building about living donation. But coercion does take, there was a theme in Desperate Housewives around coercion. There was an episode of Mom that kind of had this coercion. Joanne, you mentioned this, and I think this is so important because you had a completely separate team. And I know that Hollywood isn't necessarily going to show that, but you had a completely separate team working with you as the living donor than Judge Mosley had for him, working up him as a transplant recipient. Could you talk a little bit about that separation, almost separation of church and state there?
Sure. So my team, so I'm given a team that has a coordinator, and then you have your nephrologist and your surgeon, and then you have there's a dietitian at the very beginning, kind of talking about, not that you change anything, it was just whether I'm eating well. And then, what was it? And then there is this brief sort of psychological session that they just want to make sure you're doing this for the right reasons and that you're not having any expectations. And how would you feel if this your kidney is rejected? How are you going to feel about that? They want to make sure I'm not going to become suicidal or just be angry about it. And of course I would be very disappointed if I donated the kidney and then it didn't work, but I did my part. I mean, I did what I could there. And for me, my reason for donating was, first off, Derek is a very good friend. He has 2 young daughters that need a dad. And I just thought anybody would do this. It's like if you everybody knows somebody who has cancer and you feel so helpless. There's nothing you can do. You can bake a cake, I can't really bake a cake, but I mean, there's nothing you can do to really make a difference. This is something I can do to fix it. And I can't, though that feeling is priceless. I can't say enough about it. And I truly thought anybody would do this. So then after this story went public and people would say, or I would hear reactions, it was shocking to me that not everybody would do this. But going back to my team, that my nephrologist was at that meeting when I was on the fence about, am I going to be okay? And I just want you to tell me I'm going to be okay. I believed her. I mean, she truly, actually, I think that she would have been more than fine if I would have backed out, because it was just something, I mean, she cared so much, or as far as that I was going to make the right decision. So I did believe that this team
and the right decision for you, right?
Right, correct. Not for her or not for anybody else, but for myself. And I feel, and I clearly did. I was, always hoping to go forward, but I didn't want to put myself in jeopardy either. No one should. And they just made me feel like they were my team. They're all about me, which is their job. And I believed that they were.
And Dr. McDonald, why don't you, because you work on this every single day, these two teams. I think you've even been on both sides and worked with both the recipients as well as living donors. And, you had said something that is interesting, because this is a surgery, a living donor surgery is one of the only surgeries that physicians will perform that has no benefit to the patient.
No, absolutely. And that's something I underscore when I see every donor. Thank you for having me, by the way. And to your point, the transplant surgeons, it's sometimes a position for us because we are a part of both teams. We're a part of the donor team as well as part of the recipient team. Most transplant surgeons, or a lot, will perform both of the surgeries. I do. I lead our living donor team, but I also do 50% of our deceased donor transplants. And that's how it is at a lot of centers. And so I do get to see both sides, and I have to be very mindful not to cross boundaries. And when I'm seeing a donor, to fully advocate for what is best for the donor, and keep that separate from the decision to transplant the recipient, despite the fact I want them to get transplanted. But you're absolutely right. And when I consult with donors or evaluate them, and we go through our informed consent process, I tell them, this is the only surgery that's legal in a sense, where we know in advance we're only going to physically hurt you. And I say physically because there's obviously an altruistic benefit to donation. And we know that living donors who are healthy without any significant red flags for future kidney disease can live a normal lifespan. And that's the importance, normal lifespan. We don't want to decrease the number of life years that a donor is going to live by donating, because if so, then we shouldn't allow it. But if we can't prove that that's the case, and so far the data shows us that that's not the case, we're not decreasing lifespan years, then a donor can live a normal lifespan. And so, we're going to leave the donor with pain, surgical risks, scars, the stress of the surgery, and for no physical benefit, only that altruistic benefit. And so I really stress that, not to scare folks, but just so they feel that they're being properly informed about the risks and about their decision. Joanne, what I gathered from your story, which I find fascinating, is that there was some doubt introduced to you by the medical team when they initially ruled you out. So you're cruising along, the evaluation's going fine, and then one of your tests came back abnormal. And instead of ordering that other test right then, they told you, hey, this looks abnormal, you're no longer a candidate. So you were temporarily ruled out, and then you were recontacted and the process was continued. And, medical teams, we do the best that we can. And sometimes these things happen. And in hindsight, maybe just ordering that repeat test right then, so that doubt didn't get introduced to you. So then you thought, maybe for the first time throughout this process, man, this may not be safe for me. And that's percolating. And they're like, well, let's order some extra tests. And you're like, but wait, it may not be safe. And, the team did the absolute best they can, and you end up having a great outcome. And I hope a long-term you have a great outcome. But I don't know if it makes sense. What I'm saying is that maybe that doubt was introduced to you, and accurately so. They have to give you the results of your testing, especially if something's abnormal. But you were sort of told, hey, it's not safe, you're ruled out. And then it was brought back to you, okay, well, let's look at, so I could see why that became a struggle for you. And so I commend you that you hung in there. And
it's a really good conflict. Like that is, I can even see this on one of the medical shows, right? Where that happens. And maybe you even have another doctor, another character, like, why would you tell her that? Like, why would you introduce that doubt? Just order the other test, Well, and there could be a conversation, even on the medical team of whether to relay, how much information to relay to the patient. Do you just order the second test? You know, those kinds of things. So that little microcosm of what happened is a lot of conflict, because you want, you know, if I'm watching you guys in this story, like, I want this to happen. I'm cheering for this to occur, right? Like, this is amazing. And then it's like, what? So, so stopping the ball in the tracks. Anyway, I just can see it written on a TV show. Go ahead, Dr. McDonald.
The other thing I was going to say is what I hear you describing is just what I tell donors is the unknown variable. So there's a large unknown variable with every kidney donor. And depending on your age and your medical history, that unknown risk is greater or lower. But, you know, for example, for a 21-year-old, they have their whole life to live. Sure, they don't have any signs of kidney disease right now, but I don't know what's going to happen over the next 80 years, 50, 60 years. But even if the donor's 40, 50, 60, there's still a significant unknown variable that despite modern technology, modern medicine, all the testing that we can do, I still can't guarantee that nothing is going to happen. I can't guarantee you're not going to develop some sort of autoimmune disease or get in a car accident and your solitary kidney be injured, et cetera. So the donor and the physician have to agree together that they're willing to accept whatever degree of unknown risk that there is and feel good about that to move forward. And it sounds like that nephrologist walked that line with you very well and was like, hey, I'm presenting this all to you. I can't guarantee you that you're going to be okay. These are what the tests show, and you need to feel good. And if you're game, then let's move forward. And that's how it should be, because no physician has a crystal ball. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. Despite how smart somebody is, there's just a degree of unknown here that's risky, and you're asking somebody to take a big chance, a leap, for another human being, which is what is so cool about living donation and living donors, and why I think all donors are a hero. You're crossing that, you're taking a leap across the unknown, divide there for another man.
There was a couple of television shows where you have somebody who wants to be the donor, and then it's like the mom who's like, no, you're going to die if you do this, sort of thing. And I always kind of want the medical person in the room to be like, okay, settle down. I mean, what we do know is that there's always that risk of unknown. And we also know that you guys do so much testing with living donors because of this, that these are folks who, from all probability and all existing testing, are really pretty healthy people. And they get a lot, somebody said kind of this multi-million-dollar workup. If you want to know, if you really want a great physical, sign up to be a living donor, because you're going to get everything tested, and tested twice, 3 times, so I think that's really interesting. I do want to go into this idea of coercion, because there are elements and there are real life times where there's pressure or coercion that does occur. And I'm kind of thinking that on the real life side of things, a lot of this is internal from a living donor who it may be like their mother, for instance, that needs a kidney. And they feel responsible. They feel like they should be doing this. And even if there's something in the back of their head going, don't do this, that they're pushing themselves through the process. Dr. McDonald, is that something you've seen, those kind of internal conflicts? And then, Judge Iring was talking about how much psychological testing and things go into it. Could you talk about how in this process, in real life, you look to find whether there's any conflicts, and so that you can identify them before the donation happens?
Yeah, I think that this is a great point. And like the point of this discussion is the conflict, how it's portrayed on TV, because conflict happens every day. This is a risky business, and a lot of conflicts arise, but just how the medical team responds. And what I didn't like I did watch that episode of The Good Doctor, and I made some points of all the things that just would not happen. What I didn't like was how how they portrayed the medical team's response. That just wouldn't happen. How they responded to the conflicts. It is our job as a medical community to not only identify coercion, but also to help prevent it, because we can, even ourselves, the medical institution can pressure donors if we're not careful. And we can also not intervene if we identify pressure or coercion. So I think if anything, these conflicts are great stories to tell. And I have a whole list of them if you want some at the end, of real ones that we have come across myself, but it's how we respond. And the people watching TV want to know, okay, sure, yeah, these are interesting. The dramatic, theatrical component of it's real, but the medical community has my back. They're going to protect me, and they're not. And if anybody's coercing anybody, it's not going to be the medical team that's coercing me. And so I agree. Internal pressure or internal coercion is probably the biggest one, or the most common one that we see, and it can present as guilt, like you were saying. I'm her only son. It has to be me. So just that caregiver guilt, or it can present as confusion or misunderstanding, if you will. Something like, well, he's going to die if I don't do this. No, that's not true. There's dialysis and there's a deceased donor transplant waiting list. So I try to make it very clear. If you do not do this, he is not going to die. They will wait on the deceased donor transplant waiting list until they get another donor. So trying to intervene there and clear up the misunderstanding, so to alleviate some of that internal pressure or coercion. And also direct pressure from the family. That's relatively common. Some of that is sort of understandable. If you have multiple siblings and one needs a kidney, or there are adult children and one of the parent needs a kidney, of course, there is going to be a normal or healthy degree of pressure amongst the family, like, hey, should one of us step up? And they have to sort that out themselves. I mean, we can't step in too far, except if it becomes a little bit pathological, where we identify that the person is actually resisting this, doesn't want to do this. Then it's our job to give them a medical out, which is what you were saying. And so throughout the process, the entire process, they're told by several different members on our team that at any point you do not want to do this, that's okay. We don't even really need to know why. We'll provide you a letter stating that you are medically unfit to donate. So to give them an excuse, if you will, that they were medically ruled out, so that their loved one or whoever doesn't have to know that they decided it wasn't the best option for themselves.
And Irene was confirming that, like, up until rolling into surgery, they're willing to give that medical out, right? Like that at any point in this process, if there's just a no for you inside, that that the medical team will cover for you, and not, so your relationship doesn't blow up with this person, but that there's a medical, I've never seen that storyline. I'm like, that's the one, that's the story, right? Like that to me is such a great story. And I really hope that a Hollywood writer picks this up, because
not only that, I mean, maybe the story could be that the person doesn't even know to ask for it, but it's just very obvious. And so somebody on the medical team has to say, hey, you don't have to do this. We can provide this for you. That's also our job, is to recognize when somebody feels uncomfortable. So like on the Decrypt episode of The Good Doctor, I mean, right off the bat, when she expresses hesitancy about donating, you're not allowed to tell this person the details of the recipient. So that would never happen. So how those details were communicated, it's an ex-con or whatever, that wouldn't happen. That's illegal. And then she expresses hesitancy. I don't know if I want to donate to this type of person. That should end right there. You do, absolutely, we understand. But they took it a step further. It was not only did they not give her an out then, but they lied to her to coerce her into continuing with the donation. So there were just medical or multiple areas where it was just sort of an unrealistic response from the medical community, which I think is what's driving this entire sort of movement, is to try to represent transplantation in the light that it really is, whereas the medical community, supports life, supports patients, and respects, all of the above.
I even think it would have been a better story, that they had to just stop the whole thing. I mean,
Yep.
you would feel bad ultimately for the people then not getting the transplant, but in reality, that's the reality. And I think it could kind of leave viewers even with a feeling like, ooh, wow, well, if they had just lied, this people could have gotten transplanted today, but they weren't willing, to do that. One of the other, there's power differentials too well, actually, let me go into, because the big one, and this is The Resident on Fox, had Hollywood really wants us to believe there's a black market for organs. They really, and it's funny because almost everyone does believe this. If you walk out onto the street and did a poll and you said, hey, do you think you can buy and sell organs in the United States? I would guess that most people would say yes, because it's just presented to us as like, this is what's so. We know there's a shortage. And if there was a shortage of sugar, there would be a black market for sugar, right? Like that's just how things work. So if there's a shortage of organs, why wouldn't there be a shortage? Or why wouldn't there be a black market for these organs? In the past, a lot of these storylines were sort of like this weird chop shop in the back where they're like stealing people and kidnapping them and taking their kidneys out and they're waking up without a kidney, that kind of thing. And now it's sort of turned. I think The Resident was one of those where we saw an actual person who was an organ broker. We had a name and a face and identity and like, a wad of cash slipped over to him. And he was going to get a living donor for this person. And so it was actually a waitress. He was like, that's her right there. She's waiting on us in this restaurant. So how do the medical teams identify whether or not there is not just coercion, but potential payment occurring between a donor and recipient?
That's a great question. And to start, just to make it clear to everybody that it's illegal to exchange any organ in the United States for any monetary value. That's a law. If you're caught doing that, you pay a large fine and possibly be imprisoned. So that's a law set by the United States government, which is great. Can't speak for other countries because, some things we hear and see videos from other countries where stuff similar to what you're describing happens. And that may be the case. I don't have the details, but in the United States, it's very hard for me to believe that this black market does exist, even for the rich and wealthy. However, we're human beings and we all like to cheat and slide here or there when we can. And can you game the system a little bit? Sure you can. And we get hunches of that and we do our best to try to identify if that's really what's happening. We do our best, but you can't always prove these types of things. But to your question, the red flags for pressure and coercion, power differential, like you're saying. And luckily we discuss all the pairs, the donor and the recipient as a multidisciplinary team. And so everybody gets to weigh in and feels freely to talk. Every dietitian, finance counselor, anybody. So if anybody has sniffed out something, that gut feeling where, hey, this doesn't seem right, they have the ability to speak out loud and we all listen. So it's not just two doctors in the corner saying yes or no, it's the entire team gets to weigh in. But a power differential, so dependent children needing support, so maybe we would raise an eyebrow there if it, so a child with a parent, of course, employer-employee relationships. So maybe the house cleaner donating to the owner of the home. So maybe we'd look a bit closer at that. Large financial or access gaps. So, just like you said, maybe pairs who come, foreign nationals who come from overseas, and it's a very wealthy individual or a well-known individual, a pro soccer star who brings his younger nephew to donate for him. And maybe it's sort of obvious that they're not actually family. Do we really care they're not actually family? Well, it's our job to evaluate the donor and to try to identify any pressure or coercion. And sometimes we can't, even though we have a gut feeling maybe something isn't right. Donors without insurance or access to medical care, non-US citizens. We see that a lot. Another red flag would be a recipient who calls our living donor team frequently to ask about the status of the donor. Hey, where is she at in the evaluation? No, I need this kidney. And that actually happens. And we have to kindly tell them that we're unable to give them any information about the donor. And that's a real thing. We are unable to give the recipients any information about where the donor is in the process. So sometimes the donor, what we'll see is that the donor may tell the recipient, yeah, I've called, I've submitted my intake. I'm just waiting to hear back from them. And the truth is we can't get the donor to call us back. They don't want to donate. So when that recipient asks us, hey, what my donor said y'all aren't calling back, we can't say, no, actually, the donor just doesn't want to donate, so we have to walk a very fine balance, but we do not give any details about what's happening. And gut feeling, sometimes it's just a gut feeling or a suspicion that the pair actually doesn't have an emotional connection. So like I was saying, there are these nieces and nephews that come forward when they don't look like they're related, or there's just some suspicion that, maybe this person is being portrayed in a way and there's some sort of financial, or there's some sort of secondary gain somewhere, whether it be support or money or care or something like that. So all of these types of things should and do cause us to have concern, where we will look further into it. And that's what we're required to do. I mean, we can't prove a lot of this stuff. But luckily, like Joanne said, there's a psychological team. We have an independent living donor advocate. So it's a independent licensed psychologist or social worker or somebody who's been trained to be an advocate purely for the donor and is completely separate from the decision to transplant the recipient. And their whole role is to sort of handhold the donor through the process and make sure that they feel well informed and safe and feel safe throughout the process. And so if we think there's a red flag for coercion or pressure, we'll get our ILDA, that's what we call them, involved and say, look into this a little more. And that's what they're trained to do. Social workers and psychologists are trained to sort of kind of walk this and delve deeper. And something you can get people to crack, hey, yeah, I actually don't feel comfortable doing this. Somebody will break down and, and I just don't know what to do. And then we help them figure out what to do.
Wow, that's a great scene right there, right? Where the person is, because I would love to see, there's just so much of this like, oh yeah, you can totally pay people. Judge Mosley, I'm sure, if it was that easy, right? Like more recipients would turn to this. I don't know that you've ever had, you must know other recipients that, where this isn't a real life option.
Right. I've never heard of it before. No one ever approached me and said, we can get you this kidney. No, so I'm not aware of it as a judge either. So yeah, it's pretty much seems to be make-believe.
Honestly, if you think about it, and even well-known people, so think about celebrities who need kidneys. They have such big social circles. You think they can't find somebody willing to donate to them? That's ridiculous. They don't need to buy a kidney. People with money have good social connections. That's why, they get organs offered. So, so I tell people, don't ask for kidneys. That's really not appropriate and kind of awkward, but tell your story. Tell your story to everybody you know, church, loved ones, friends, social media, everybody you know, because there is somebody who's willing to help you out there. You just have to get that story out there. And these people who have means, whether it be monetary or entertainment means or whatever, just have bigger social nets to cast. And so I don't see how you have to go to the trouble of doing something illegal behind the scenes and pay, when all you have to do is, anybody with money or who has a big social network, just post your story on your Twitter page. And the next thing you know, you're going to have people who are willing to help.
Well, and I think, Judge Eyring, like for you, I want to just go back, and we're almost out of time. This went so quickly. I'm so excited. But I want to kind of end on that feeling that you had where you're like, duh, like, obviously I'm going to do this. Not everyone has that feeling. There is apparently some research that shows that people who have larger amygdalas, like there are certain people in the world who have that, sure, yeah, you should have my organ. And that's one of the things in Be Positive, the character Gina is like, yeah, take my organ, take it. So could you just talk a little bit about that feeling, that emotion, like when you found out that your friend needed a kidney, what came up for you?
Well, when he first learned about it, it was pretty devastating for and actually both our families. But uh, and neither of us knew anything about transplantation. Um, although we knew it was a thing, we knew nothing about details. And so he'd said that he needs a transplant. He talked about the 5-year or 6-year wait for one. And then I said, I mean, I didn't even hesitate and said, well, I'll be tested. And he wasn't very welcoming about it because he knew we were so different. Like, yeah, go ahead, you can go through that, but I'm pretty sure we're not a match. And we knew nothing that there was even an option about paired or the chains. So it was either me or nothing. And so he, of course, didn't think I would be a match. And anyway, and plus I didn't know what my blood type was. We knew he was a B positive, and both my kids are an A positive. So I thought for sure, I'm sure an A as well. But so I started to donate blood to find out what my blood type was, and found out it was a B positive, which was huge, kind of a big, huge step for me. I was very excited. And then filled out the form, and then learned about the paired and the chains, and said, of course, I would love to be the direct match, but if that isn't going to work, I'm whatever it takes. I did say, don't be fooled by my size. This is always a standing joke with me and my team, is don't be fooled by my size. I have big feet and big bones. I'm pretty sure I have big organs too. And sure enough, big as ever.
That is hilarious.
But yes, I did. I mean, I really thought anybody would do this. I just thought it's just something you do for your friend. It's the right thing to do. It's the thing. And it was such a gift for me, the feeling of being able to be the one to make the difference. Again, I have no words for that. There's nothing better in life than that feeling.
Well, there isn't anything better in life than that feeling, which we kind of know with this Be Positive campaign, this Be Like Gina campaign. So this is the PSA. What we've done is created a landing page, Be Like Gina, with stories of altruistic living donors. You notice they're all 3 women. It's actually statistical that women are living donors at higher rates than men, and consent to donation and are registered for donation at higher rates. So keep giving life, these women. But you can hear from real life living altruistic donors. Research shows that one of the best ways to encourage people to become living kidney donors is by hearing stories of people who have donated, not necessarily the recipients, but the donors themselves and what they feel about it. I'm going to just show this PSA, which is 10 seconds, super short.
Gina found a sense of purpose by being a living kidney donor. Could you be like Gina?
See stories of living kidney donors at belikegina.org.
Very simple. 14,000 people went to the Be Like Gina page after that 10-second PSA. 25 people actually signed a form saying that they were interested in taking the next step to be a living kidney donor. So I do think there are other Ginas and Joannes out there in the world who are looking for an opportunity to help someone. And I think that idea that, like, when someone has cancer, all you can do is bake a cake. But when someone has kidney failure, you can donate a kidney, and that you can really transform someone's life that way. And so I think more people are really being called to that as something very purposeful. So I want to be mindful of the time. Thank you guys. This was really interesting. I want to highlight a couple of things. The payment for organs in other countries, that is a thing. And we have one of our DLH medical experts, Dr. Danovich, is sort of like the preeminent guy who knows everything about it. And also the ethical debate or conversation about payment for organs, whether that would actually benefit people, is that a good idea? So there's a whole debate about that, which also could be a great storyline. So any writers, just contact us. All of these medical experts that we have, Judge Mosley, Judge Eyring. You can talk to them for free anytime. We can set you up. Dr. McDonald, we can set you up with her, and she can tell you more stories of really these kinds of conflicts that have happened and how they've been resolved by the team. So all of the services that Donut Lake Hollywood has for writers are all completely free. And just thank you guys so much for sharing your stories and unraveling some of these conflicts so that we can help writers do better in the future. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you at the
Thank
next.
you.
Thank you,
Writers
Tanaya. Thank
panel.
you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you,
All right,
everyone.
bye-bye.
Great day. Bye-bye.